Hello everyone, my name is Colton Davis and welcome back to Kalulu Talks. Today we're going to be talking about utopias, or at least the idea of utopias. Today's title will be Utopian Dream Leads to Dystopia. Maybe I'll say Utopian Dreams, because that seems to have a better ring to it. But basically the idea of today's episode is to talk about why is it that when people try to pursue utopian ideologies, they tend to create a dystopian outlook of their actual lives. And although no true dystopia has actually been created, we have gotten very, very close, so much to the point that I would argue that some societies should be considered dystopias. Now, with that being said, a lot of projections of what a dystopia is, or even a utopia for that matter, tends to be fantastical or even science fiction-like. And with that being, kind of understanding that most of these constructs come from like the dream aspect of like societies, specifically from like media, your old science fiction stuff, things like that regard. There is some religious institutions as well, but do produce the idea of a utopian-like society, the idea of something perfect after death, but whether or not you believe that you get some magical utopian society when you die or not isn't what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about why humans definitely probably shouldn't be trying to make utopians here on Earth. And for some very, very good reasons. With that being said, I am going to go ahead and title off what we're going to be reading about today. I've made several notes. 5 segments in total, but YouTube you only get 4. Like always, because Rumble is a better platform for me, I'm going to actually put all 5 segments here on Rumble. So, if you're on YouTube, go check out Kalulu Talks on the Rumble. With that being said, let's kind of begin. So our first segment is titled What is Utopia? In this segment, we're going to be talking about what my idea of what a utopia is, as well as what I was able to research off of the internet. We're going to go to the second segment, which is the attempts at creating utopian societies. We're going to be talking about 2 unique attempts here. We're going to talk about the New Harmony attempt, as well as the idea of what Epcot was going to be. And our third segment would be what is dystopia. Once we get done and talking about what utopias are, I kind of want to touch up on what the idea of dystopian is. We're going to be talking about some various factors. We're going to be talking about some various regimes that came out around this time period. And then the fourth segment, which would also be the last segment YouTube would get, will be the utopian dream leads to dystopia. I'm going to be explaining why is it that when we try to actually push utopian ideas and measures into place, they usually fall to the wayside and turn into dystopias. Or at the very least, dystopian-like experiences. And of course for Rumble only, I'm going to give my personal thoughts. With that being said, let us begin with the first segment. Alright, our first segment is what is utopia? So, the note I have here first is just the basic definition. And I've looked at several definitions to come down with one I think kind of suits it well for today's topic. And the definition is the idea of utopia is a perfect place in all social and moral aspects. Now, does a utopia have to necessarily be a perfect place for all social and moral aspects? I mean, technically it doesn't. You could also argue that a utopia is a place that has found a solution to all of its problems, or at the very least knows how to accomplish all of its feats and desires. Even still, though, this is a pretty good definition to go off of, because it kind of describes what most people try to do when they implement utopian-like ideas. You're trying to figure out issues within society. And although I didn't include it in the first note, we'll include it now. Let's say economic, social, cultural, and political issues as well as moral framework. All these factors would have to be put into place to understand a utopian-like ideology and how to actually make it accomplish. Same thing with infrastructure and supply lines. Now, with that being said, however, it tends to be a scheme for economic, social, culture, and political reform. The same aspects that it tries to promote within its ideological perfect landscape tends also to be schemes used by other outside negative individuals. I can literally point to almost any aspect you can think of that is promised to make a better society. There's some dude back in there, I remember, he killed an entire cult using Kool-Aid with the idea of that when they died they'd make it to a utopian-like paradise. I mean, I hate to tell you this, but that is a good example of a scheme for the idea of a utopian-like ideology. So yeah, A lot of people have done this, whether it be for religious reasons or other, economic, political, etc. So we're going to start looking at them individually. What are some schemes people use when trying to peddle utopian idea before we answer the total question of what is utopia? So first off, economic. The reason why I put economic here is very, very important. Most people who try to peddle, especially in a free nation, in a free market society, they'll peddle the idea that a certain economic function will lead you to a utopian-like experience. This is the reason why traditional capitalism actually died out in this country a long time ago. It slowly made its way up to neoliberalism that we see now. People continued to promise that a different, more controlled system, one after the other, would lead to a more utopian-like experience. And although to some aspects it was somewhat true, this was also used to peddle power to people who really shouldn't have had it, and now it's starting to fall back against them. We'll actually talk more about that in the next segment when we talk about the attempts at creating utopian societies. But other than just economic schemes, when it comes to the idea of production of a certain economic structure, you can also argue that they're trying to push economic practices on people. A good example of this is consumerism and materialism. This was pushed very strongly back during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, maybe even the 50s. The idea was simple. You buy things, they make you happy, and it makes your life worth living. And this is true, you buy pizza, you will be happy. I'm not going to argue that. But the thing is, if you peddle it as the only solution to happiness, to create a utopian ideology, eventually they find out real quick that you can have all the junk in the world that ain't going to fix the lingering issues that are inside your brain. I hate to tell you this, but humans, they need more than just physical things to be happy. They need purpose. They need meaning. They need more of a, pseudo-spiritual, like, ideologue to make them happy. Otherwise, it's going to break down on themselves. And I actually don't think you can fix that for any length of time. I believe you can only find temporary solutions over and over again to fix that issue, since most people have to continue reminding themselves or continue finding purposes in their lives to be able to quench this thirst. So, the economic scheme for utopian ideologies are usually done by peddling malicious individuals, sometimes on purpose, sometimes not, to either sell a product or to try to reform a system that would benefit them more. Now, the next scheme you see with people who are peddling the idea of a utopian ideologue, is a social one. So social is pretty interesting because this is usually done by activists, or by, in more modern day, tends to be of the CEOs of social media. In the older days, let's say, 60s, 70s especially, you would see a lot of social reform when it comes to like hippie culture and things like that. And although you would argue that this could have some benefits, you would also argue that it could have some economic downturns. For example, if you stop cutting trees, you don't have warmth in your house anymore. You don't have wood. You don't have anything that requires wood-based products. And you have to resort to plastic. When the hippie culture came in, we saw the increase of plastic for a good reason. And of course, now we're starting to see the massive health issues that are because of plastic products. So social reform that comes to activism isn't necessarily always a good thing. And I'm just using the hippie culture because that's more relevant in American culture. But we could look outside of America and find more examples of negative social aspects. There are also religious manipulations for the idea of utopias as well. Like I said, cults, which would, like suicide cults, are a good example of this. Outside religious influences interacting with the inside the religious influences of a country, trying to overturn the culture, things like that. You really need to keep a close eye on a lot of those social and religious aspects when it comes to that regard. But another thing when we look about the social schemes of utopian, like I mentioned, is mostly the social media in modern day time. Things like people like Mark Zuckerberg, for a good example, will call their people, and excuse my French, but he's actually called his own users on his own platform dumb blanks. Don't know how many times I can use a bad word to get away with it, so I'm going to try to be a little more okay with it, but essentially this dude's not a good dude. And he manipulates them by utilizing these social media platforms. Now, at this point, I'm pretty sure most people kind of know that Mark Zuckerberg is a bad human being, but To be fair, though, they still use this platform. Why? Because they believe that's the best way to get some sort of social interaction in today's time, and they might be right. I've actually mentioned how people are becoming more and more incel-like in a previous video. Um, and that's the thing what's sad, that once they start accomplishing their schemes, they do actually take away more values within the current society, even if it takes them away further away what their idea of what a utopian society would be. Then we gotta talk about the culture schemes. People peddle culture all the time. Most of the time when someone peddles a better cultural ideologue, it's usually somebody who's trying to push a political faction, because usually cultural and political reform come into kind of the same category. In my notes, I actually put a plus next to them both because they tend to work in unison with each other. So usually if somebody comes in and starts peddling for a new cultural idea, they're actually trying to push a political idea. And the reason why is because culture tends to be downstream from politics. Now, is there examples what aren't connected in one way or the other? I'm sure there is, but in my research I couldn't find any. So that's kind of a creepy thing to mention. But what about the political reform? I think this is the most important one, because when we look at throughout history, when it comes to people who come up with an idea of what a utopian concept was, usually they push political reform. New Harmony, the thing we're going to be talking about in the next segment, is a good example of this. Karl Marx, he preached a better society based off of political reform. Joseph Stalin, Adolf Hitler, I can name a bunch of names, Mao from China. A lot of people, a lot of negative individuals who utilize a political reform-like structure and peddle the idea to their people in attempts to make a better society of tomorrow. They might not use the word utopian, but that's kind of what the idea that they're trying to peddle is. But they think would bring up the best society possible. And do I believe it's a good idea to actually try to make the best society possible? Absolutely. You should aim for the stars, but you have to be careful. Because when you try to make a perfect society using your system, understand that you're only human, and there's no way you can figure out every single flaw within that system. I would try to create the best one, but not aim for perfect. You don't want to go for perfect. I think that's the trap, and we'll explain more about it in the next upcoming sections. So, the last note I have here is it tends to be viewed in a future or fictional setting. And this is true. When we ask the question, what is utopia, we need to also understand how it's typically viewed. It is never really viewed in the present. You cannot make a utopia society today, and that's important to understand. A lot of the time, people who peddle schemes about utopian societies, they peddle schemes with the idea of a future that it's utopian. Or it could be utopian if this would have worked, the fictional setting factor. Now, of course, when people think utopian, they think of the sci-fi media and things like that. But when we talk about people applying these ideologues in real life, notice how they can never peddle it for today. They can never peddle it for next week. They have to go to the future to peddle their ideas. This is a big red flag. If somebody cannot guarantee immediate results now, and I get that some things do have to be projected within the future, but usually you can get a timestamp on when you think these aspects are going to happen. If somebody has to peddle the idea of something happening in the future, it probably means it's a scam. And the reason why is because they want it to hurt quick and fastly so they can get what they want out of it and then split. It's kind of the concept of people stealing the silverware on a sinking ship, essentially. So, the best way I can describe utopia, it's the idea of a perfect place in all of its aspects, or at the very least, it has a solution to fix all of its problems. However, it tends to be either a scheme or a scam for individuals of power, portraying a futuristic and unrealistic, unattainable idea of the future, instead of actually viewing the present issues they have then and now. Alrighty, let's go into our next segment, attempts at creating utopian societies. Alrighty, so our next segment is attempts at creating utopian societies. Now, to be fair, most nations try for utopian at some point. If your nation survives long enough, within the grand scheme of things, they will attempt to make some sort of utopian society. I don't know why they do this, but they do attempt at some point. Sometimes it's just the idea of a utopian society for the elites, sometimes it's for everyone. But that's the thing about dumbasses, the best way I can say it, is at some point they're going to actually try for gold when they should probably be trying for bronze. Now, why is it that most nations try for utopian at some point? And I think it's, one, they get overconfident, especially nations that see constant golden ages. Like, there's no doubt in my mind that the golden ages of the Soviet Union made them push very hard for their socialistic idea of what a utopia was. Even though after its golden age was over, it collapsed faster than a brick in water, but same thing goes with Yugoslavia and various other countries like that. And then when it comes to the capitalist countries, when they see a lot of golden ages one after the other, they tend to divide. One tries to make a utopian idea on one section of the idea, and the other goes in the opposite direction, and they tear each other apart. Now, you can argue that a utopian society would be only possible if they could unify, but I don't think so either, and I think Epcot's a good example of that. But we'll talk about that in just a moment. Another example of why maybe a nation will eventually try for utopian is also because of, I don't know, normalcy bias. They get tired of being normal and they want to go, shoot for the stars. That's fine. You should try to be the best nation you can be. I don't think any nation shouldn't try to be the best nation it should be. But going for perfect, I think, will have more negatives in the long run than, just going for functional. Like, let's just go for functional first, and then go on from there. If you can somehow break the mold and become an actual utopia, let the whole world know how you did it, because that's freaking great. But, realistically speaking, probably ain't gonna happen. So, let's go ahead and start talking about our first topic. We're going to be talking about New Harmony first, when it comes to this segment. So, New Harmony was actually one of the earlier attempts at creating a utopian society. It was established around 1825 to like 1827, or maybe it just lasted 2 years. It was a town established in the state of Indiana by Mr. Robert Owen. Now, the town was an early socialist experiment which attracted lazy and corrupt people that led to its collapse. Now, this is interesting. So when I was researching about utopian attempts, I figured I'd put this one in as an example of the socialist side of an attempt of a utopian society. And what socialism does, when people try for socialistic utopias, and heck, even just socialist normalcy, it tends to attract lazy and corrupt people. After all, if everyone's making the same amount, why work extra hard for it? And because, like, typically in a free market society, the person who works the hardest will be the one who's rewarded the most, and thus it creates an incentive for people to try to advance. Hence why I believe neoliberalism actually leans closer to socialism than it does to capitalism for most parts. It still has a capitalist structure, it makes it better than a socialist idea, but because the way neoliberalism is created, it kind of eventually evens out to the point of attracting lazy and corrupt people. But of course, I can talk about economy crap all day. This ain't about economy today. But I will say one more thing about that, for those who are like, neoliberalism ain't close to socialism. Have you noticed that a lot of fast food places, grocery stores, gas attendants, and even some hard labor areas tend to all make the same amount of money in today's time? Yeah, a little bit of that has to do with the minimum wage, and a little bit has to do with the way neoliberalism is structured, and they kind of work on each other at some point. And we're seeing a lot of people not want to work anymore in today's time, and one of the things that makes me wonder why, maybe it's because everybody's getting paid the same amount. So why work a hard labor job when you can make the same amount of money doing retail or flipping fast food burgers? You see my point? As more and more people get paid the same amount for different levels of work, you will start getting lazy individuals working in these fields. Because why work hard if you're going to make the same amount anyway? And the same thing goes with corruption. Like, why not be corrupt if the corrupt people have a higher chance of being rewarded for it? And that's the reason why I think socialism fails, but it's also the reason why neoliberalism ultimately fails. Because these systems end up rigging themselves to eventually reward corruption. They don't reward good behavior. In fact, good behavior in some cases could probably get you imprisoned. And that's the scary thing about it. So New Harmony, although it did attract some intellectuals and things like that, people who were able to run the system, these intellectuals and these early businessmen, they left. Why? Because they found out that people who would abuse their structures and their businesses were the ones who were getting rewarded, while them who were actually bringing in the businesses were not. And New Harmony is a perfect example because Robert Owen preached for an idea that a utopian society would be plausible, and then it collapsed relatively quickly. Something about it, though, is that it was the typical socialist idea that everybody would be paid around the same amount, everybody would share a group resource, and you see how that just does not work in a traditional society. And before people start saying that communism is better, wasn't true socialist, or any of that arguments, I want to mention that New Harmony would inspire Karl Marx on his work for communism. Karl Marx, the guy who made communism, yeah, he was inspired by New Harmony. People tend to forget that socialism came out before communism. In fact, Karl Marx, I'm not sure what the exact quote is, but I believe he quoted that socialism is the way toward communism. Ultimately, the two structures are very, very similar to each other, and they function almost identically. With maybe one of the major differences is state ownership and communal ownership. But with communism, you really can't have communal ownership because it's more of an idea, and we work in a physical realm, so ideas that don't have anything based off of backing of a physical construct ends up throwing ownership over to something that does have a physical construct. And in a battle royale, the only person who's standing in any type of organized structure would be the state government. Hence why communism tends to fall time and time again back to the state. Hence why communism really doesn't work, because eventually the government does get, in one way or another, total ownership. In socialist societies, where the government in itself is supposed to be managing all the resources for its people, understand this. You literally just gave them state control over everything. And of course, politicians are not good economic people most of the time, so they end up either undervaluing an object or overvaluing it, and then setting prices to something that is unaffordable. Or is not affordable enough and causes like businesses to go out, which only forces the need to have more and more state ownership to be able to keep it from collapsing underneath itself. And because of this, the value of those dollars don't grow, and at the very least, they don't grow very fast, and it tends to cause a lot of economic strife within these systems. Now, with that being said, it's kind of obvious how New Harmony failed. It failed due to economic strife. And this was an attempt to try to get rid of that. This was an attempt early on to make a utopian society. Now, I did use one from the 1820s, so maybe that was wrong on my part. But do understand that other attempts after this have came about. But there's a reason why you don't hear of them, because they didn't work either. Now let's talk about a capitalist one, because I put two in this section. The next one we're going to talk about is Epcot, aka the Experimental Prototype Community of Tomorrow. Epcot was a utopian project created by Walt Disney himself. So Walt Disney, way back when, I don't remember if it was like the 50s or 60s, I think he died in 1966, so it was probably in like the 50s or 60s, when he started coming up with this idea for an experimental prototype community of tomorrow, Epcot, and he started making like models and stuff over it. The idea never got thrown in stone, although the early models of Epcot actually did show some promise, but was canceled in 1966 after the death of Walt Disney. Now, the idea of Epcot actually still lives on. It's typically a theme park, which you can find in, I think, Disney World? I actually went there. I should know if it's Disneyland or Disney World at this point, but, you know, whatever. Pretty cool park, if I'm being honest. But would this idea work if it was actually implemented? The reason why I put Epcot here is because I think it would actually fail pretty bad. When I went there and visited, though, I was glassy-eyed, and I was actually like, wow, this might actually work. But no, after doing some research, there's no way this would work, because the economic structure that Epcot was actually supporting was very similar to what neoliberalism would become. Now, not saying that neoliberalism was inspired by Epcot, I don't think it was, I think it's coincidental. But the way they're both implemented are almost identical. which means that Epcot would eventually fall to the same issues that we have in today's time, but maybe even faster because of the way it was built. But it is interesting to see an idea that almost everything would be self-sufficient, because that's what Epcot's design was. It was pretty much you have a central structure where it acts as all your political buildings and things like that, as well as outside structure for residentials with easy-to-get locations, monorails, moving conveyor belts which would take you from one location to the other very quickly. Transportation-wise, I think it would have actually been a big success. Like, literally, if you look at the infrastructure Walt had, it was actually genius. However, when it comes to the actual implementations of its economic structures, I think it would have ultimately failed. But the reason why I put both these there is because one was a theorized one, and the other one was a actually implemented one that failed, and one was more capitalistic, while the other one was more socialistic. I think New Harmony is the perfect example of what a socialist idea of a utopian society would be, while Epcot itself is the prime example of what a capitalist idea of a utopian society could be. Now, could Epcot get off the ground, though? Because it was obviously canceled when he died. Personally, I think it could have, but the board members saw a better idea to make a theme park out of it, other than, actually trying to make a utopian experiment out of it. So, this is another good example, and I like to put this down here of why these systems don't even have a chance to get it off the ground half the time, is because of corruption. In a free economic, free market side of things, economic corruption is very common, unfortunately, in our society because it is a free and open market. And even if you did have a theory or even a strong basis on a perfect utopian-like society, would you be able to get it off the ground to even start it? With how much economic corruption there is, I don't think so. Because the moment Walt died, they canned it instead of letting the board actually try to do it. Why? Money. It always comes back down to money in most cases. So, yeah, those were some of the attempts of creating a utopian society. Both of them failed ultimately. And there are way more I can list, but I also don't want this video to be really, really long since we have 2 more segments we have to go over. But yeah, I think these are 2 good examples for multiple reasons on why attempts at creating utopian societies tend to fail. Now, our next segment, we're going to talk about dystopians, and then I'm going to summarize it all up in the 4th segment while giving a personal thought segment on the 5th one, which, by the way, Rumble only. Alright, let's go into the 3rd segment, y'all. Alright, what is dystopia? This is our next segment. So, when we talk about utopia, it's important to understand the polar opposite, and that is dystopia. I kind of made a hybrid definition here because I've seen a lot of different definitions on the internet for dystopia, so I kind of grabbed what I think kind of makes the best sense of dystopia altogether. And the note I have down here is, it tends to be a place where the quality of life is very bad, or it can be a place where the populace is living in oppression and is in a state of terror. Now, we've seen stuff in both fiction and reality, which kind of gets close to this, but we'll talk about the more real stuff in the next note. For this note, though, I want to mention like Mad Max, the Fallout universe, V for Vendetta, stuff like that. Even George Orwell's book. I mean, all of these factors come into play when you look at the fictional idea of what a dystopia is. Now, with that being said, it kind of needs to be brought up to our next note that no society has perfectly matched what most people envision what a dystopian society could be, but it's important to note that some societies could be considered dystopian. And what do I mean by that? Technically, when we talk about dystopia, the original definition is basically a science fiction or a fictional-like location. It is not real, but it's the idea of a really hell-scaped construct. But when people think about whether we are living in a modern-day dystopia or we are heading toward a modern-day dystopia, we have had some instances in our own human lives and existences what do get very, very close to these definitions of what dystopia could be. Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, China, specifically Mao's, but Xi Jinping's not too far behind, North Korea, various African regimes. You had Venezuela recently when they turned into socialist over there. I mean, dystopias happen whenever you get to a point where either the quality of life is bad, or oppression is increased, or even if you're living in a state of terror. A lot of people believe that we in America are heading toward a dystopian society due to the increase of AI overreach, the metaverse, social collapse, culture collapse, economic collapse. Good gosh, what's not collapsing in this country? But all these factors combined, they believe it's going to lead to American dystopian. And even if we somehow keep some aspects of American dream alive, if you're living in a metaverse and your utopian ideas in your head and not around you, you'd be living in the pod and eating the bugs. I would argue that that's a dystopian world. So there is a somewhat futuristic idea of what a dystopian could be as well. Which kind of brings me back to the previous segment when we mentioned that it's usually like utopias. They're usually promising a better tomorrow. They're not talking about a better today. Dystopians work very similarly. They promise a worse tomorrow, not a worse today. And the reason why they do that is so that way, if it does get bad today, they promise that it's going to be much worse tomorrow, so they can kind of keep you in a loop of thinking that it couldn't get any worse than it already is. And that's what's funny about understanding dystopian definitions and things like that, is people do play against that as well, but they do it for the complete opposite reason. When people start talking about dystopias, especially dictators, when they start doing this, they're actually trying to kind of hide how bad their own situation is versus what it could end up being. And they're probably not lying. It could get worse in most cases, because you always hear the phrase, it can't get any worse, but no, it could always get very worse. And that's something that I find fascinating, is how the definitions are typically used. Utopias are promising a better tomorrow instead of today, so that way they can eventually manipulate power to gain what they want to do. While dystopias, they're usually also promised tomorrow, but that's so that way they can keep going a little longer from the already crap existence they're probably living already at that moment. Now that doesn't mean that you can't argue that you've reached a dystopic point, though. And it's hard to tell when you've actually reached to a point that you could call technically dystopian. But I truly believe that if you look around, eventually at some point you kind of have a, contingency bias is when you've reached that point of no return. You could argue Mexico might be a dystopian-like society, because they ain't really getting no better anytime soon. If anything, they continue slowly going worse and worse and worse. I think, with the exception of El Salvador, most of the countries down south of the border are not doing well for the most part. But even then, that's, kind of a stretch on my part saying that, because it's hard to really tell to what point would be considered dystopic. So, my idea of dystopian is usually a radical change to the negative of a current society's sustainability. That is my idea of a dystopian-like infrastructure. Whenever it falls down to the wayside, either to the point that the quality of life is low, or oppression is really high, or if you're in a state of terror, that's when I usually state that you've reached a dystopic point, or if your society balance has changed so much that it no longer represents what you once were. Like I said, if everybody starts living in the pod and eating the bugs, even if they're fine with everything else, this is probably dystopic. Alright, our last note for this section. This one is not as long as the other ones, because I'm just kind of describing the idea of what dystopia is. Because then we're going to explain the big meat of the of this video, and that's going to be talking about the next segment. But the last note is that most societies that get close or could be considered dystopian have all done one thing in common. And I'm going to say that again. Most societies that get close or could be considered dystopian have all done one thing in common. They have pursued a utopian idea. A lot of people forget this. Look at Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany. Look at Joseph Stalin's Soviet Russia. Look at Mao's China. Have you noticed something with all of these societies? They all promise a utopian-like idea in the beginning. They all do. And when they try to actually pursue that idea with their policies and their tactics, typically they actually fall into a dystopian-like world. And I think you could argue that this is communistic, because all those countries, I believe, are somewhat communistic, with the exception of Nazi Germany. They were fascist, but they all kind of lead to a more controlling, kind of a controlling atmosphere, I guess you could say. So you could argue that only one type of group of people could actually produce this, but realistically saying, I believe if you put too much effort in any aspect, you could reach this. Because if you promise a utopian idea, and you push hard enough in that direction, you will go overboard. become radical in that direction. A good example of this is centralized bank. Uh, like here in America, with neoliberalism, we do have a centralized bank. It's called the IRS, the Federal Reserve. If we push too hard in that direction, we become fascist, because that is what a fascist society is. It is a government controlled by a central bank. It is an economy which is based off of the central control of a central bank. A lot of people forget that, and although there is some aspects of racism from like Nazi Germany and things like that, that is the exception. It's not the rule, because the rule of fascism is more so economically motivated than racial motivated. But typically, the countries that do practice fascism also become racist. But I don't know why that is. But it's important to keep an open eye about that. So if we decide to give more and more control to our centralized bank, it is totally possible that America could flip into a fascist country. And if we give in more and more social reforms, we become a socialist country. If we're given too many communal reforms, we become a communist country. If we keep an open market, we've yet to see that go really bad. It's probably the best thing to do, to not have a centralized bank and keep control of an open free market. Hence why I'm a big fan of traditional capitalism, or even creating a new free open market system than neoliberalism that we currently have, as I see it as a very strong slippery slope, because it pushes stronger in three directions, being socialistic, communistic, and fascist, than it does in traditional capitalistic, spheres. And it's very creepy to understand that. It's technically a capitalist system, but it's barely a capitalist system. So yeah, I do believe that neoliberalism could fall into this group. And keep in mind, we preached that neoliberalism was going to bring us to a utopian-like society, and it did not. It has so far become more and more dystopic over time. But if I stay on this topic, we'll be on it, like always, forever, so we need to keep on moving forward. Plus, the next one is when things get very interesting. So our next segment, we'll be talking about now. Alright, so our fourth and final segment for YouTube is called Utopian Dream Leads to Dystopia. If y'all want to see my personal thoughts section, which will be the fifth and final segment, it is on Rumble only. So please check it out there. With that being said, our first note for this final section, and the one I'm really excited about, is unrealistic expectations. So, one of the biggest reasons why people's utopian dreams lead to dystopia is actually because of unrealistic expectations. A lot of people will try to force something, and they'll sometimes try to force it quickly in order to get what they want. Even if you try to force it slowly, it's never a guarantee. For a good example, so China, they went ahead and implemented the one-child policy. This way they could maintain population control within their society, because they believed that they were about to be overpopulated. It's not a very good idea to ever try to mess with your population, by the way. But basically what happened here is that they were not thinking about the fact that the culture of China did not like women, for the most part. This is because parents would prefer boys to be able to watch over them when they get too old to take care of themselves. They also want boys to be able to carry on their family name. So what happened is that these older generations, they went ahead and aborted their little girls. So when the boys got old enough to be men, and they needed to go get wives for themselves, you now have a population crisis in China, because there's no women left to really build families. In fact, I think the average dowry now in China is the equivalent to like $1 million US. So a lot of guys in China will not have children. And as a result, the next couple of generations will see a massive population decline in China. And not just that, the women who do have children right now tend to only have one child as well. And this is kind of disturbing. I mean, I don't care much about China because it's a communist nation. I mean, I care for the people there, but that's about it. And it's disturbing because when you look at the unrealistic expectations of societies which lead from utopians to more of a dystopian future, it's that you need to look at every variable if you're going to try to actually go for this. You gotta look at culture, you gotta look at social, you gotta look at your economics. And that brings me to another thing, is the conflict of ideas. And before I hit that note, we'll also mention this as unrealistic expectations. Corporations, on average, if they're trying to push a futuristic agenda, because we now know in modern day times that a lot of corporations are less financially and economically motivated. They are more so motivated by ideological beliefs. So what they'll do is that they'll use their mass amount of wealth that they've produced over the many years to either lobby to try to get a change within your society. But let's say they don't do lobbying. Maybe they don't want to get involved with political stuff. Well, they might try to cut out the competition and create more of a monopoly like source. All these factors are something you need to understand about unrealistic expectations, because once you try to force that, people usually have a lesser, higher quality of work. Usually the prices of various products go up because of lack of competition. And next thing you know, your ideologue does not succeed. Why? Because you had an unrealistic expectation that you yourself would be able to push your ideological. But then there's the conflict of ideas. Let's say you're building yourself a utopian society, and you find yourself a realistic solution to fix your problems. Well, you're still going to have somebody within your society who says, I like X, and the other person's going to say, well, I like Y. If somebody who likes solution X is not going to agree with somebody who likes solution Y, you now have a conflict of idea, and now you have a divided nation. Now, this doesn't always mean civil war. Look in America, we haven't quite reached like bloodshed in the streets yet. But if we're even to go back just up to the 1980s, a divided nation is just pretty much having two different political understandings of the solutions that you're currently dealing with. The conflict of ideas is something that spreads throughout all of history as well. It's one of those situations you can never really get rid of. And although it is possible to have a unified ideologue in your nation, this takes a long time to actually be able to form, and it usually doesn't last for very long. We see some instances of it happening from here and there, but it's usually due to warfare. Like when there's an outside source which is directly threatening your nation, that's usually when the people come together to agree on a certain united idea. So you have to make sure you have a realistic expectation, and you're going to have to make sure that you can unify any conflicts that are within your society when it comes to ideas. Once you do that, which is going to be near impossible, you now have to deal with the unintended consequences of your actions, which goes back to the first note we made in this segment, which was unrealistic expectations. When people make unrealistic expectations, it's easier to make unintended consequences. But even if it's realistic, alright, even if you find a realistic solution to make your idea come to reality, you still have to worry about the unintended consequences of said idea. And now you have a new solution. You thought it was going to work. Your people thought it was going to work, but it doesn't work. So what do you do then? Well, for one, I'm going to tell you now that it's going to recreate a new conflict of ideas. Because if your original solution did not work and you now have a negative consequence, you have one group of people saying we should go back to the way it was before, another group saying we should push forward, and another group who thinks you should try something different. This is how conflict of ideas start whenever you've once had unity and something goes wrong. Now, does that mean there's always a negative unintended consequence? No. There can be a positive unintended consequence, but the rate of it happening is very, very low. I think it's like 20% or so. I could be wrong. And there's a good reason why that is. As humans, we're consumers, and biologically, we consume resources in order to survive. Now, nature does produce a lot of resources. Sometimes it can outproduce us even in some areas. But we're not really a tree. So I hate to tell you this, we usually consume more than we produce. And what that does is that it tends to make a negative if we try to make something new. Because the system we got currently working, that is working, is because we found a way to actually work with the sources that are being produced in a way that doesn't create a negative solution to us. For example, if you want to make sure every person can have free electricity, well, I hate to tell you, you got to find a way to make that electricity come from somewhere. And if you're not careful with it, the negative consequence is that you will quickly run out. And you have other issues like that pop up as well. Unintended consequences are something you have to really think about. Or how about this? Texas, they had those windmills when they were powering a city a few years ago. But when the ice storm came in, it froze them all up. A lot of people died in the cold because they had no electricity anymore in that entire city. And that's something you got to understand when we think about unintended consequences. But it seems like a good way or a good idea at first. very well might be a negative within just right around the corner. But let's say you actually have a positive consequence. Let's say you have a realistic expectation, everybody has a united idea, and totally positive consequence from your action. Heck, let's say it worked better than you originally planned. Well, now you have a new problem. Human nature and its imperfections. Humans naturally are greedy, selfish, gluttonous, and sometimes even lustful. With all these negative factors, and heck, I'll be even honest, they carry a bloodlust sometimes. And humans are stupid too. So just by looking at all of the basics of what is human nature, it's only a matter of time until somebody does something really stupid, either for their own self or just from a mistake. That somebody's working on a major infrastructure problem. Alright? Well, they didn't see where all the nuts and bolts were supposed to go, and it collapses. And this was supposed to be a major, secure installation of your society. If that collapses, let's say it destroys your entire society as a whole. Let's say it just crashes your economics. Or let's say somebody who's greedy found a way to get in there and steal a bunch of money, completely top-siding your society. So human nature and its imperfections make it really very hard for any type of utopian dream to start. We see this most in socialist and communist nations. I hate to tell you this, but the state itself is ran by people, and the reason why socialism and communism tends to not work is due to the fact of human nature. And not just that, the people who need to be continually producing things to be able to live the society they want to create, they tend to get lazy because they're not getting paid the same amount as they're getting paid the same amount as everyone else. And that's the big problem. Why do harder work if you're not going to get paid more for your harder work? And this brings us to another thing, though. Let's say somehow you keep human nature in check. Maybe you use robots or AI or something like that. Let's say you get all the issues we've already talked about completely under check. I don't think it's possible, but let's say you do. Well, you now have a new issue called resistance to change. People do not like change. And if you're changing rapidly, you better believe there's going to be a rapid resistance built up around you. And even gradual change will eventually create a resistance around your idea. And now you have a new issue. Because if you have a resistance, now you're going to have a conflict of ideas, which you thought you just fixed. And that's because over time, as things continue to change, you will have constant new resistances that grow to your ideas. That's something you really can't change. And not to mention that human nature at any time can, turn into a negative. I mean, even if you have robots running your system, who's to say that some human ain't going to try something stupid for the sake of greed? Or even somebody making a mistake. At any time, this can kind of happen, but like I said, we're playing make-believe right now. So let's say you crush the resistance, whatever, and you maintain your utopian-like society. The thing that guarantees that it will die every single time is on the last note here. Evolutionary nature of a society. Societies change over time. They change due to a lot of factors, both inside and external. If we look at the external factors first, we need to understand that nations, criminal activity, natural events, meteors, who knows, maybe a meteorite will come and hit your society, climate change. Any type of thing that happens outside of your society will force your society to have to change. Or heck, even mass exodus of your society. You don't know, people might want to move away at one point. Maybe there'll be too many people going on vacations. Maybe too many people will be immigrating. These evolutionary natures of societies does force your society to now change. And if you've developed a utopian society to work on just those issues that you'd originally fixed, new issues might actually make it impossible to be able to, fix it. So, in order to have a utopian society, they're going to have a solution to fix every problem that they have and might have in the future. And I don't think it's possible to predict all those outcomes. Because who knows, we could have freaking aliens pop out of nowhere. I don't even know if aliens exist, but heck, they might just come on a dang satellite or something and crash into Earth. How do you fix that issue? Are they violent? Are they peaceful? Will there be a rash of xenophobia? Maybe they're nice guys, but, humans might not always be nice. Like, all these factors can force your society to change. But that's just the external stuff. Let's talk about the internal stuff. So another evolutionary nature of a society is what happens internally. Keep in mind, we used to have a traditional capitalist society, but it turned over time into neoliberalism. All this was in effect because we didn't want to actually, fix the problems that was with original traditional capitalism. Why? Because we thought it failed. We now know it wasn't the system that failed, but it was the other systems we placed around it that failed. You cannot have a traditional capitalist society with stocks and bonds, but we tried anyway. And that's the other thing, is that your economics, that can force your society to change. Your policies, that can force your society to change. How people clean their house can force a society to change. Let's be extremely arbitrary here for just a moment. Let's say you have this new robot mop that shows up out of nowhere. Well, people start pushing the idea of traditionalism because they realize they're not getting enough exercise. So now they start buying all the old-fashioned mops again. Well, those robot mops, which were super effective for your society and way better for it, are no longer being used. So now everybody is using traditional mopping methods. What do you do then? Next thing you know, because they're not effective as robots, you now have more disease. You might have to force the robots to come back, but then you have a resistance to change because people might not like that idea. You see the issue? All the issues here can potentially reopen up due to X or Y or Z different solutions. There are so many ways your society can fall down on itself that it's impossible to predict every single branch and connecting solution to it. Utopian dreams do lead to dystopia. There is no other way around it. And the reason why is because it's just too complex. Perfection is something that humans are not meant to achieve. In the AI image you have, right here, a guy holding a model city, what he envisioned to be a utopian landscape. But by pursuing this idea, it turned him into this. And now the world around him is collapsing. The best way I can describe the idea of utopias is that they are doomed to fail. And instead of trying to go and create a perfect society, we should just simply try to create a society that is functional and it works to the best of its ability. And I do believe experimentations of political systems as well as economic systems are completely justified. In fact, you should try these systems. In fact, you should experiment with these systems. But at the same time, we need to understand that backtracking is not necessarily a bad thing. We need to understand that sometimes pushing forward is not necessarily a bad thing. And we also need to understand that change is not necessarily a bad thing. But every time we make one of these adjustments, we have to deal with other issues that will come up because of these adjustments. So perfect society is impossible, and it's impossible to get everything you want. When I was a kid, I literally believed that if we did everything correctly, we would actually reach a utopian-like society. Now, as an adult, I realized, although that is possible, we are humans and we have different desires and wants. Not just that, if utopian ideas exist, it can actually shut off some of the factors what make humans human. For example, if everything was perfect, you no longer have struggle in your life, and eventually this will cause you to be depressed. Without struggle, there is no purpose. There must be some amount of hardship for you to be able to continue pushing forward in some branch of your life to be able to make your life worth living. And that's the biggest point here, is that we need strife. No strife, your life will be hell. That's just how it goes. So I actually like living in the society we do today. I think it could be better. Hence why I advocate for traditional, capitalism. I would like to see neoliberalism die in my lifetime. I really would. I think it's one of the worst capitalistic systems you have, and it's the one that's currently being practiced in this nation. I would like to see us stop using stock markets. I'd like us to stop using a fiat currency. Is this all going to happen? Maybe. But it's also possible that it won't happen at all. But all we can do in our society is try our best to be able to fix the issues that come about when they do. Now, with that being said, I think I'm going to end this segment here, and I'm going to talk about my personal thoughts of it next. And it's going to be interesting because my personal thoughts now is how you can live the best of your life knowing that you can't reach a utopian society. So that's going to be interesting. If you want to see that, please check it out on Rumble and YouTube. You all have a good day now. Like, comment, and subscribe.